Well, good morning, and I'm delighted to be here. Very grateful, and thank you, Jim, for the wonderful worship. Can we thank him again? I sort of feel like we can just go home. We know who Jesus is now, and just head home. But they asked me to read a paper, so I should probably do so. During my last year at Wheaton, I had the pleasure of watching the beautiful mosaic just outside the doors here taking shape. The mosaic stimulates my theological imagination. I've been fascinated by the story of Jesus' encounter with the Samaritan woman really for over a decade. And in my 2009 book on Women in the World of the Earliest Christians, I explored how some details in John's narrative of her life might connect with the reality on the ground in Samaria. So I'd like to explore that same area with you again this morning, but with an eye to the theological impact of the encounter. So I'll beg your indulgence as I view the Samaritan woman as an historical figure for the sake of this paper. I realize scholars debate the historicity of this story. My contention is that she is a plausible historical figure. Her exchange with Jesus is historically reliable for reasons that I'll expound upon below. And the theology expressed in their discussion further reveals who Jesus is. The Samaritan woman explained to her local community the answer to Jesus' question, "Who do you say that I am?" The Samaritan woman's testimony that Jesus is a prophet and is probably the Messiah follows both Jesus' claims that he brings living water and his revelation that he knows her marital situation. Acknowledging that he is a prophet, she proceeds to question him about the relative worth of Jerusalem and the Samaritan holy place, Mount Gerizim. The apparent change of subject has led some to suggest that she dodges Jesus' challenge to her sinful lifestyle, for she's not married to the man that she is with currently. I argue, however, that this unnamed woman acts in typical ways that reveal Jesus' atypical qualities and that confirm him as the Savior of the world to her and to her community. Please note, this entire story makes sense only if Jesus is really human. Her humanity reinforces Jesus' humanity and vice versa, as well as then serves to highlight his divinity. So to defend my argument, I will look at three typical features of the Samaritan woman's life and then follow with three atypical characteristics of her life that spotlight Jesus' remarkable person. The typical features include, first, that she identifies herself based on her marital status. Second, that she engages in religious conversation with Jesus. And third, that she speaks to the town about her discovery. As I think will become apparent, these typical features have been presented as atypical. And I think when that happens, the entire encounter is misunderstood. The atypical characteristics of the narrative include, first, that she has had 5 husbands. Second, that she would meet a Jew, especially one who asks her for a drink from her bucket. And third, that the encounter would lead to the town's confession that Jesus is the Savior of the world. So let's look first at the typical behaviors or typical attitudes. First, she identifies herself based on her marital status. The Samaritan woman asks Jesus to give her water that will quench her thirst forever. Jesus replies that she should go back to town, get her husband, and then return to him. He assumes she's married, which is a pretty safe bet, as most women were married or widowed at this time. Her response is simple and direct: "I have no husband." Jesus agrees with this statement, and then he adds that she has had 5 husbands and is currently with a man who is not her husband. And he concludes, "What you have said is true." This answer then leads to her claim, "Sir, I can see that you are a prophet. after which she questions him related to the proper worship of God, Mount Gerizim or Jerusalem. Now, this exchange has puzzled scholars, leading some to conclude that she's immoral and crafty. Immoral because she's not married to the man she's living with and presumably having sexual relations with, and crafty because she changes the subject when Jesus touches on her allegedly sinful life. But is she in an immoral relationship? To help answer this question, I'd like to look at what we know about marriage at this time, and do so primarily through the lens of the Babitha and Salome Komaise archives. These early 2nd century Jewish women saved a collection of personal documents, including property deeds, dowry documents, as they hid in the caves along the Dead Sea during the Second Jewish Revolt, which was from 132 to 135 AD. The documents reveal existing marriage possibilities as well as legal options available to sort out family problems. The marriage complexities of the day include the option of polygyny, what is known as an unwritten marriage, agrapha gamas, unwritten marriage, and concubinage, or being a concubine. The legal claims on property and inheritance play an important role in marriage matters. Moreover, we should note that women were required to have guardians when they executed legal documents. This would include dowry certificates, loans, property disputes. Sometimes their husbands served as guardians, but not always. It wasn't always even a family member that would serve as a guardian. Now, before we get into the complexities, I'd like to sketch a typical marriage expectation. Women often brought a dowry into the marriage, and its contents, the financial contents, were spelled out in detail in this legal document. The husband had full use of the dowry money while they were married, and he could keep any profit that he made on the money. The dowry principle, however, was to be returned to the wife if the marriage ended or if she became a widow. And then she was free to use that money as she wished, often having it as an inheritance for her children from that marriage, or keeping it for herself if she remarried and allowed that money to roll over into the new marriage. The husband's family, if there was a divorce or she became a widow, the husband's family might require that when they returned the dowry money, the widow make no further claim on the husband's estate, nor could any of the children of that union make claim against the husband's or their father's family. Not all families did that, but some did. Jewish women could receive property from their parents or their husband through the mechanism of deed of gift, which was a document that deeded land or buildings to their wife or their daughter. So in this way, we might say that daughters could inherit so long as there was this deed of gift. Let's turn to Babitha's documents, which were part of the Yadin papyri that was discovered in the Cave of Letters at Nahal Hever in 1960-61. Babitha's archives consist of 35 documents in various degrees of decay. They were written in Nabatean Aramaic, Judean Aramaic, and Greek. She kept them in a leather purse that was placed in a water skin, along with balls of flax thread, different colors. Additionally, she wrapped individually her own marriage document, her mother's deed of gift from her father, and her second husband's daughter's marriage contract. Overall, her documents reveal a woman of means whose parents had property and money. Babitha was born about 100 CE, Common Era, or AD, on the southern tip of the Dead Sea in the town of Mahosa, and lived around the sea for most of her life. From her legal documents, we can trace Babitha's timeline. In 99, right before she was born, or right at her birth, her father bought property, date groves, from a Nabatean woman. In Around 120, Babitha marries a man named Jesus, and they have a son also named Jesus. She brought a dowry of 400 denarii into the marriage. This same year, Babitha's father gives a deed of gift to her mother, Miriam, 4 date groves. In this document, the father stipulates that if Babitha becomes a widow, she is entitled to live in a hut in the courtyard of her mother's place. She forfeits this if she remarries. It is also likely that in 120, Babitha receives a deed of gift of property from her father, which he bought in 99. Well, within the next 4 years, Jesus dies, leaving Babitha a widow with a young son. And legally, he is understood then as an orphan. Her archives indicate that Jesus' family returns her dowry without complaint, but we'll see she gets married again, and that second experience doesn't go so well. Also from her archives, we know that her son was given 2 guardians in 124 to handle his inheritance coming from his father. Now, it may be that at this point, Babitha and her toddler are living with her mother in this hut in the latter's courtyard. Now, Babitha becomes frustrated with her son's guardians, who aren't distributing funds with the generosity that Babitha wants. The guardians distribute only 6% of his inheritance per year, and Babitha wants to be able to manage the funds. She would contribute from her own resources then. She gets her dowry back, right? So she would contribute from that such that her son would receive 18% of his inheritance. It does not appear from the documents that she was successful, even after several attempts over an 8-year period. The documents do not say why her requests went unheeded. Between 125 and 128, Babitha remarries now to a man named Judah. So maybe she's 26, 28 years old. We have this marriage contract written in Aramaic by the husband, Judah. This document stipulates that if he dies, she can live in his house and be cared for as a widow. Most scholars believe that Babitha's second husband, Judah, is also at that same time, concurrently, married to a woman named Miriam. That is, Judah didn't divorce Miriam before marrying Babitha. This is bigamy or polygamy. Josephus, a Jewish historian in the 1st century, and also Ben Sira, which is a Jewish document from this time, both talk about, to one degree or another, that this practice within Judaism, but bigamous relationship is not recognized by the Romans. We can only speculate on why Babitha would have entered into this relationship with Judah, but she does, and she provides Judah with a loan of 300 denarii, which contributes to his daughter's dowry of 200 denarii, which then she uses to marry her husband, Judah Simber. And the document indicates conditions applied to how her dowry might be returned. So this daughter, Shalom Zion, also receives a deed of gift from her father, 128, 11 days after her wedding. The father's gift includes half a courtyard and some rooms, and then she will receive the other half of the courtyard upon her father's death. Also about this time, Babitha registers her own property in a Roman census. Well, within 5 years, Judah dies. He has not repaid the loan to Babitha, so she takes his property as payment. Now, Judah had a brother who's deceased, but the brother had sons, that is Judah's nephews, and they have a guardian named Basis. There is no quiz on this, by the way, if you're jotting down notes. But isn't this like a soap opera? He sues on behalf of the nephews. He sues Babitha because he doesn't really think she has first claim on these date groves. Okay. A second, smaller archive contains similar documents from a woman who lived in the same region as Babitha. Her name is Salome Komaise. She saved 6 documents these documents were written between January 125 and August 131. Included is a document produced by her mother named Salome Grapti, and the mother wrote this when her son died. Her husband was previously deceased, then her son dies. This document stipulates that Salome Cohick will renounce all claims on her mother's property and her mother's money. But then a few years go by. In 129, Cohick receives a deed of gift from her mother that is activated at the time the deed is signed. So it's not something that will happen when her mother passes, but is effective immediately. The mother writes this just as she has remarried. And so it may be that she is deeding property to her daughter in the event that perhaps this second marriage that her mother enters into produces a child, in which case maybe some of the money that she wants to go to her daughter would instead go to this new in this new family. The gift includes a date orchard and half a courtyard and some rooms. Now, at this point, Salome Cohick has been married and divorced to a man named Samuas, and she is living with her future husband named Jesus, son of Menachem. Now, there are no documents that are preserved about this first marriage. But in 131, Cohick and Jesus drew up a marriage document that included a dowry of jewelry and clothing valued at 96 denarii of silver. In this document, there is a phrase, and you can see it there on the slide, a phrase that includes that they continue life together as also before this time. So the question is whether the couple and their neighbors and family, and perhaps also the religious leaders in their area, would they have agreed that even before this document was written, the two were married? Or does this document create the marriage, in which case the two were cohabitating prior to that? Did the new document arise because this couple was expecting or had just had a child, and so they wanted to care for the child's inheritance? The legal archives of Babitha and Salome Cohick, including the stories that we learn about their husbands, their daughters, their sons, their parents, the various relations, they create for us a sketch of real lives engaged in typical human interactions and struggles. So how might their stories help us understand the Samaritan woman? On the one hand, the archives demonstrate how frequently women were married, widowed, or divorced, and remarried. And they show that polygamy and potentially cohabitation were options. Both Jesus and the Samaritan woman agree upon the fact that the man she is with is not her husband. So in some way, we know that her current situation is different from the 5 previous relationships that can be identified by both Jesus and the Samaritan woman as marriage. So what might her current situation be? Did she receive a divorce from her 5th husband that was based in her mind and Jesus' mind on non-valid reasons from, as I say, from her viewpoint? And did that render her unable to describe her current situation as a marriage? Cohick's document indicates that she was divorced prior to her marriage with Jesus, son of Menachem. We know that women could separate from their husbands, but again, they required a male guardian to effect any sort of legal process in the courts. I don't know how many women sought divorce. There aren't that many individual stories that we have of women seeking divorce. There was Valeria Paula, who divorced her husband, Brutus, the lead conspirator behind the assassination of Julius Caesar. We also know of Queen Berenice, who we know her from Acts 26. and she divorced her third husband. We have no record of a woman filing for divorce more than once. So it's quite plausible that the Samaritan woman was divorced by one or two of her husbands, and maybe she initiated one divorce through her guardian, but it is highly improbable that she divorced 5 husbands, or frankly, that she was divorced 5 times. Did the Samaritan woman lack dowry documents? And would she and Jesus both have assumed that a document was necessary to make the marriage valid? I'm inclined to think that most people in Jesus' day would not have disapproved of what they called an unwritten marriage. Documents were expensive to produce, and they were useful primarily to protect property and valuables. There was no state-issued marriage license the way we have today. Right? So you produce a document to state, here's my property, here's what I'll get if this marriage dissolves or I become a widow. If you have little to protect, then there's probably little felt need to create a document defending what you don't have anyway. We have no idea whether the Samaritan woman had any wealth, but John's silence on this case probably indicates she was unremarkable in this category, just like everybody else in her town. Well, was the Samaritan woman in a polygamous relationship? And if so, might Jesus have discounted it as not a valid marriage option, given his words in the Gospels about marriage representing the two becoming one flesh? Now, the Hebrew, when you look at the Hebrew of Genesis 2:24, it's they shall become one flesh, but the Greek translation of the Hebrew, the Septuagint, is clear. It's two become one flesh, and that's what we see in the New Testament. So maybe that was Jesus' position. Would the Samaritan woman, though, have shared his position? We would have to speculate that she does, and so she answers to him, the man I'm with, I have no husband. The man you're with now, you're right, is not your husband, because we agree that you're in a polygamous relationship, which I don't count as marriage. It's reading a lot into the text. It could be that she is a concubine, which is sort of like a second wife. The Romans did not practice bigamous relationships, and they had certain rules on who could marry who based on social status. So often there would be a relationship, a man with a concubine. The concubine could be charged with adultery, so it was a formal relationship in a certain sense, but she nor the children inherited anything if the relationship was dissolved. Could it be that the 5th husband died, but the brother refused to marry her? As such, she's unable to enter into a valid marriage with another man. That's an idea that is out there. The assumption is here that the Samaritans were following the Levirate marriage practice as outlined in Deuteronomy 25. What if her answer, I have no husband, refers to the fact that she's living with a family member? That she's not having sexual relations with the man that she's with because he's her brother or her father or her uncle. Census data from this time shows that widows, if they didn't remarry, would likely live with their father or their brother or maybe their grown children or their mother or their sister. Given the evidence about the various ways marriages were enacted at this time and the number of women who remained widows, we cannot say that the Samaritan woman's situation was viewed by her neighbors or Jesus as immoral. The townsmen and the townswomen believed her without qualification. And they didn't say, wow, you've changed so much from when you left to get water to when you've come back. I doubt that they would have accepted her without qualification if they thought she was an immoral woman, if they thought she was a prostitute. Unless, of course, the Samaritan men typically believed women of ill repute. I've actually never heard that argument. We give men usually the benefit of the doubt. So why did Jesus even mention her marital status? Well, part of that I'll answer below, namely the number of her husbands is quite remarkable. But an additional reason is that most women were identified by their marital status, whether they were yet to be married, they were married, they were widowed. This is evident from the literature, from the documents, from our inscriptions. A scholar, Jacobine Udchorn, in her book that looks at these, at the Babitha and Salome Komaisi documents from the standpoint of local law and Roman law, she observes this. She says, quote, that women's archives yield more personal information than men's is due to the simple fact that documents on personal matters like marriage, gift within a family, and so on, were usually drawn up in favor of women and were therefore kept in their archives. And she continues, marriage contracts, deeds of gift, and comparable documents ensured the women of rights they might have to claim many years after the event. Interestingly, when we look at the documents preserved by men, in the same area, in Nachal Hever, we find that men preserved business or military or administrative sorts of correspondence. And this matches what we know about women's public persona. They rarely identified themselves or were identified by their occupations. Instead, they were identified on gravestones or inscriptions in relation to their male family members. This typically, not always, but typically. Additionally, as we've seen, their legal claims often relate to their children's inheritance. They need these dowry documents proving their marriages and their deeds of gift or property deeds, not always just for themselves, but also for their children. Well, not only does the Samaritan woman, I think, get unfairly labeled as immoral, but often further support for that claim is drawn from the fact that she asks Jesus a religious question. And the idea is, well, you're changing subjects, switching from marriage to talking about where one should worship. Now, unfortunately, our legal documents don't shed light on the religious affections or temperaments of Babitha and Salome Komaise. What they do show is that women were present in the court, as well as in the buying and selling of their products, in the business of loaning money. I can't imagine Babitha engaged in all of this commerce and family business without speaking in public on numerous occasions. So the mere fact that the Samaritan woman spoke with Jesus should not give rise to concern about her moral character. Even more, why would the Samaritan woman talk about religion with Jesus? Well, I would say it actually would be quite odd if she hadn't raised the particular question that she does about Mount Gerizim and Jerusalem. This was a burning question in her day. We can pick up a bit of the religious conversation among Samaritans from inscriptions. We have one from Delos, an island off the coast of Greece. This was done in 2nd century BC, and the inscription reads, "The Israelites in Delos who send the temple tax to holy Ar Gerizim," which is how they said Mount Gerizim. This highlights a diaspora Samaritan community who self-identified with the ancient Israelite faith and declared that its holy place is Mount Gerizim. This temple on Mount Gerizim was destroyed in 110 or so by the Hasmonean, the Jewish king, John Hyrcanus. So the wounds between the Samaritans and the Jews are still quite fresh at the time of Jesus. Additionally, the scriptures used by the Samaritans, the Pentateuch, stress Mount Gerizim. So there is a sectarian aspect to the Samaritan Pentateuch. But the undertext, we could call it the Proto-Samaritan Pentateuch text type, also circulated among the texts at Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls. So what this indicates is that in the fairly recent past, Jews and Samaritans used similar biblical material. My point is simply that the Samaritan woman's question was hardly an idle one. It wasn't designed to switch topics. Instead, it represented long, ingrained practices and then questions resulting from those practices between her people, the Samaritans, and the Jews. And those questions are based on shared biblical texts interpreted in significantly different ways at key points. That this religious conversation is important in John's gospel can be highlighted by a few points. First, John expresses his theology often through dialogue, and the conversation between Jesus and the Samaritan woman is one of the longest in John's gospel. It is also the case that not only here in our story, but elsewhere, John highlights Jesus' preternatural, that is, his supernatural knowledge at several points from the first chapter of the gospel forward. Finally, my Wheaton colleague, Michael Graves, pointed out to me a story of the wife of Rabbi Meir, who is, this is in the later Jewish texts, the Mishnah and Talmud. We find this woman represented. She talks to men about religion. We have other places in rabbinic texts where rabbis talk about religious matters with wealthy Roman married women. So while it's difficult to establish the historical veracity of each of these stories in the rabbinic material, overall, the picture painted is that in certain circumstances, it's neither immoral or incongruous for men and women to speak together about religious matters. Well, I've talked to you about, I'm behind. Here's Mount Gerizim. I talked about her marital status and her religious conversation with Jesus. These are both typical, is what I'm driving at here. Left to be examined is the testimony to her town. See, it's commonly held that women had little authority in their communities. Men lived in the public realm, women stayed in the private sphere. The ancient evidence to the contrary, however, greatly weakens this supposition. Women could make vows. They could execute loans. They bought and sold goods and real estate. Now, women were potentially handicapped by needing a male guardian to execute these legal documents, but it is also the case that grown sons, if their fathers were still alive, they also did not have the freedom to make independent decisions. They were still under their father's potestas as long as their father lived. The guardians for women were males, apparently without exception. They could be relatives, they could be husbands, or not. But the lack of direct access to the courts need not imply that women had no public voice. The archives we've examined indicate active engagement in the economy and in the court system. Babitha vigorously seeks the welfare of her son through the courts. She's aided by her guardian. Yeah, the system was prejudiced against women, we might say, but it didn't silence them. Moreover, Jewish women made religious vows and worshiped with men in the temple. You're probably familiar with, this is a reconstruction of Herod's temple. And at the bottom of the slide there, you can see the court of the women. I used to think that the court of the women was like the ladies' room. There were no men there. But that's actually not what it means. It means all the Jews came through this room, or this courtyard, but only the men then were allowed to go up those half-moon steps into the next courtyard where the sacrifices were made. So Jewish men and Jewish women worshiped together, even here at the temple. So there's no a priori reason to assume that the Samaritan woman's voice would be tuned out by her male neighbors. They'd be aware of Jesus' presence, of course, because the disciples were in town buying supplies. And Jesus will talk to the disciples a little bit later about how they failed to see that the harvest was ready to be harvested. They aren't talking, apparently, about Jesus and the good news to those in the town. But the Samaritan comes in. She reports her conversation and her conclusions. She reveals this expansive truth brought by Jesus. Within the narrative itself, Jesus insists that what she has said is true. Remember that line? He acknowledges what you have said is true. Now, that term is used by John in a positive way throughout his gospel. So Jesus' appraisal of her comment should be heard as positive, or at least at the value neutral. Again, her testimony to Jesus' miraculous knowledge is similar to Nathanael's amazement at Jesus' supernatural perception of his person and his immediate past. You see this in the first chapter of the Gospel of John. The Samaritan woman's conversation parallels Nicodemus's in that both misunderstood Jesus' claims, but the Samaritan woman then goes and testifies to her people, "He told me everything I've ever done." Nicodemus questions Jesus twice and then fades from the narrative. To summarize my argument thus far, the typical aspects of the narrative include that Jesus would identify the woman based on her marital history. The two would have a conversation about the religious significance of Mount Gerizim and Jerusalem, and that men would listen to a woman's comments, all things being equal. Those are the typical aspects of this narrative. Let's turn to the atypical behaviors or attitudes. These include the number of husbands that she's had, the request by Jesus to receive a drink from her, and the remarkable claim by the townspeople that Jesus is the Savior of the world. So first, that she has had 5 husbands. We have no evidence that a man or a woman had 5 consecutive spouses and was living with the 6th. 2 figures come close. Agrippa, a friend of Augustus, was married to his 5th wife when he died. And Queen Berenice, the granddaughter of Herod the Great, she was married 3 times. She was widowed twice by the age of 22. She was divorced once. Josephus, the Jewish historian, alleges that before her 3rd marriage, she conducted an incestuous relationship with her brother, Herod Agrippa II. We also know him from the biblical text. I'm not saying that Josephus is right, but this is the scuttlebutt on her. In her 40s, Berenice had a tumultuous love affair with Titus, the heir apparent to Vespasian, and several years her junior. Vespasian, who's the emperor, and Titus then becomes the emperor. He does not ever marry Berenice. Let's just say our Samaritan woman did not run in the same circles. She's not at the level of Queen Berenice. There is a tradition, I won't get into it here, but there is a tradition of interpreting the 5 husbands symbolically. I'm not persuaded by those arguments. We can also find, though, examples where a number is used for rhetorical effect. So, for example, in the Second Temple book called Tobit, we read this sad story of a young woman named Sarah who is married 7 times, and on each of her wedding nights, the husband dies. Yeah, the story ends a little bit happier for Sarah. She does eventually marry Tobit's son, Tobias. He survives the wedding night with Sarah by some angelic intervention and incense. I think he burns fish liver. That's just a public service announcement from me to you, if you know I want to get married. From the New Testament, we know the Sadducees try to trick Jesus with the hypothetical case of a woman whose 7 brothers, the 7 brothers marry the same woman consecutively, and then they, in short order, die. The hyperbole in both the stories serves to heighten the drama because the details are impossibly far-fetched. But in our story, the Samaritan woman agrees with Jesus. She has been married 5 times. This number is remarkably high, but it's not absurd. It's not rhetorical. The takeaway here is that Jesus' statement highlights this highly unusual reality. It's not a lucky guess on his part. If he said, yeah, you've had 3 husbands, it'd be like, oh yeah. You know? So the fact is, she has a remarkable history, and he knew it. He knew it it had to be supernatural that he knew that. Secondly, the Samaritan woman was surprised to receive Jesus' request for a drink. John tells us of the antagonism between the 2 groups, Jews and Samaritans. I've already talked about that. So the atypical aspect of the story is that he would want to get some water from this Samaritan woman. Finally, the confession by the town that Jesus is the Savior of the world. The town's people heed the Samaritan woman's witness, and they believe. They subsequently go out, they speak with Jesus, their faith is reinforced. They pronounce him Savior of the world. That's an exalted title, and he accepts it. Interestingly, Jesus, although we call him rightly so Savior a lot, it's not a common title for Jesus in the New Testament, probably in part because you had generals, Roman generals who were called saviors as they would win a battle or a war, and also the emperor was known as Savior. So when they pronounce him as Savior of the world, this is a highly exalted title. Conclusion. What is at stake in my reading of the Samaritan woman? I think it challenges the status quo assumptions about women's basic worth and their capacity for religious thought. The Samaritan woman is not a trope. She's not a symbol. It's not a metaphor. Within the narrative of John's gospel, she is a flesh and blood woman who speaks with a flesh and blood man. The man's tired and thirsty. She is needy and curious. This is the stuff of everyday life. This story is an example of the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Jesus explains to the Samaritan woman that a day will come when all people will worship God the Father in spirit and truth. He does not say that humans will become merely spiritual beings. Jesus points to the creaturely, embodied worship of the true God that's based on the revealed knowledge that he brings. So Jesus' incarnation was not mere clothing of a disembodied soul. Jesus exists now in his post-resurrection immortal body. John tells us at the end of his gospel, Jesus invited Thomas, touch his raised, glorified body, this body which displays the wounds of the cross. I invite you to take another look at the mosaic and the narthex. Notice that the woman's face is on the same plane as Jesus. They're presented as the same size. And I see in this a visual affirmation of the text's presentation of the Samaritan woman. She is every bit as the human that Jesus is. In the mosaic, she focuses her gaze on Jesus, thereby accurately representing her testimony to her people. And Jesus looks directly at us, bids us to listen to her testimony, and so believe. Thank you.
We have a few minutes for questions. Thank you so much for bringing her not only in her own context, but also to us. If you would come to the podium, say your name and ask your question.
Judd Spencer. I'm one of your many former students who was blessed by your ministry here, so thank you for that as well. As a preacher, one of the things that we love to talk about in this is that the woman comes in the heat of the day when no one else is around because of her shame. Can you address that? Does that throw a wrench in anything you said? Is that inaccurate? Where does that play in?
Yes, I think the reference to the time of day helps us understand why Jesus is tired. I think if it was 7:30 in the morning, he wouldn't be tired and thirsty. So I think that's part of it. Secondly, I haven't found places where it indicates that coming at noon is a sign that you're an outcast of the village. In fact, we do have certain stories in the Old Testament where in the noontime or in the afternoon, men meet women at a well, and there's no aspersions are cast on those women. I think it's only because the man you're with now is not your husband that we then, assuming that means she's immoral, we then find other areas in the story to reinforce what we've already concluded, I think concluded wrongly. Finally, I would say that when I lived for a couple of years in Kenya, and what I noticed about myself, being an American, is that I have an 11th commandment, thou shalt be efficient. And what I saw with the women that lived in some of the towns around us and who did their washing in the creek, and then hung their wash over bushes to dry, that they didn't do that first thing in the morning often. Often they were trying to get the tea, the kettle, the pot boiling. Sometimes that, if you're using a wood fire, which they did, would take a long time to get going. And then they finally got the tea ready for the family. And all this manual labor that happens means that sometimes they didn't get to do their washing till noon or 2 or 3, which meant that the wash wasn't dry, had to sit on the bush overnight, and then the next day would be dry. And there was nothing immoral about that. It's just kind of how the day went. So maybe the Samaritan woman had gone with everybody else in the morning, and then now noontime she realizes she needs more water for whatever reason, or a neighbor does. And she says, don't worry, I'll go. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Peter Cardillo. This has to do with the second point as to the atypical features of the story. I guess it's sometimes used as a criticism for the veracity, for the historicity of the story. But I think it misses a very important point. I mean, couldn't you use the same objection to say that Jesus never would have allowed a prostitute to wash his feet, or Jesus never would have claimed to be God, because a first century, Palestinian male would never dream of such a thing? Isn't everything Jesus did atypical? So, I mean, can't we just dismiss that in the narrative by saying it was Jesus? Of course he's going to, if anybody's going to speak to a Samaritan woman, it's going to be Jesus.
Yes, and I think you're right. Of the 3 atypical points, even John himself brings out the fact that this was not typical, but the disciples, of course, are in town talking to Samaritans and getting food for them. I think, though, that there are enough examples of Jesus doing typical things that allow us to see at times when he does something atypical. So I still think the category of typical and atypical is possible. Is that what you were getting at, or were you?
Suggesting that as a criticism for the historicity of the story, to say that first century Palestinian male would never have spoken, or Jewish male would never have spoken to a woman, can be dismissed immediately because of the fact it was Jesus doing it. And everything he did was atypical. If anybody's going to speak to a Palestinian woman, it makes sense that Jesus, the disciples, had they been there instead of Jesus, probably never would have spoken to her, because they would have observed customs, whereas Jesus wouldn't necessarily observe that custom.
That's possible. If I'm tracking with you, yes. So his speaking to the Samaritan woman broke down. Pardon?
It's not remarkable that he would do that. In the same way, it's not remarkable that he would let a prostitute wash his feet.
Or speak to a Canaanite woman, where in let's say Matthew 15, where his disciples clearly want her to be quiet, and Jesus nevertheless reaches out to her and praises her and her faith. Yes, but there would be some things that he does. He stays kosher. Otherwise, Peter's vision in Acts 10 doesn't really have doesn't carry the same force. They weren't having cheeseburgers in Galilee. his group. So I think there are enough. Well, anyway, yes. Thank you for your point.
Hi there. Thank you so much. I'm Zen Hess. At my church, a young woman painted a lovely picture of Hagar at the well. She's another woman who's just on the edge of the promise in the way that maybe Samaritans would have been perceived by Jews to be just on the edge of the promise. I just wonder if as you've studied this passage, read those stories together and maybe let them bear on one another, and if you have any thoughts on that kind of intertestamental connection.
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you. The short answer is no, but I should. I think where I would pick up the Hagar and where people are doing a lot of work on this is from Galatians, where Paul is talking about Sarah and Hagar and reads some things as analogy, but I think there's a lot more there. The complexity of the Hagar situation, including her status, if you will, as a slave woman, would complicate things in useful ways, and then kind of a direct comparison to the Samaritan woman. But you're absolutely right in terms of being on the edge in things both women are, and both are met by God, and that's a beautiful picture. Thank you.
Okay. Well, would you join me in thanking Dr. Cohick for